Good morning, and again, welcome to Anthropology 4310, Theories of Culture. I want to make one announcement, or I guess editing of the syllabus. Inadvertently, we had forgotten or omitted one of the sections, an important one at that, in your from your textbook that would serve as a topic for your group presentations, whether you're from the home viewing audience or whether you're from the class here in the basement of the library. And that is the section on structuralism. And what we decided to do was to, on page 7, to add it as an option in the same class meeting as ethnoscience and cognitive anthropology. In other words, it's too important a section to just let remain excluded, and it fit best in there, I thought. So that's what we're going to do with it. So if that's a topic that you would like, that includes such anthropologists as Claude Lévi-Strauss, who's extremely important in the history of anthropology, especially as a representative of a contribution from French anthropology to American and British anthropology, and also other folks as well. I think there are 3 articles there, one by I can't think of his name right now. But anyway, they're important, and they're also another option for you in terms of the different topics that you can choose from among. And again, I want to remind you that you are responsible for group presentations, whether you are the home viewing audience or whether you are members of this class, or if you're, I think we have one student at a site location. And each group will be made up probably of some home viewing students or distance education students and some of you here in the classroom. So it's a matter of that you will be meeting outside of class, and you will create the presentation that you're going to do. If you are going to have the presentation done at a time other than the class period, then you will have to arrange for that taping with the people here in the television studio. They will help you, and they will, insofar as they can, they will be flexible, I have been assured. So you need to get your group together and talk about that, and talk about when you want to do it, etc. Those are important requirements for the course, and that's why I repeat them. A lot of the home television students seem to feel that since it's going to be difficult for them to do this group thing, that they can omit that requirement. No. You cannot. So those of you at home, be encouraged. And again, this becomes really one of the more exciting parts of the course, at least has been my previous experience, and one that when it's over, you will enjoy more than most. That's what all students tell me. I've never had anyone come to me and tell me differently. So whatever. So with that out of the way, we can now get on with today's agenda. First, I start off each class by giving a brief overview or review of what we have covered this far, or the last time, I should say. And then it's also a time that I encourage you, if you have some, to ask questions. I'll be happy to ask any question. And if you're going to ask a question, just for the technology of it, as I understand it, you hit the microphone in the front there, and it automatically picks up your voice, and I think the camera automatically switches to the one that's on the students. You know, it shows you all generally rather than on one of you, so don't worry. You're not going to be highlighted, but your voice will be heard that way. So as you're speaking, have your hand on the microphone, as I understand it. All right, last time it was the introductory lecture, and we covered some of the major assumptions that the course is based on, and the first one that I mentioned is the importance of the connection between Western history and the development of anthropology as the discipline it is today. Really, anthropology is a Western discipline. It was created and is a byproduct of the empire building, conquest, and colonialism that is a part of our history. I didn't know that when I took anthropology courses as an undergraduate and then as a beginning graduate student. And again, it wasn't until the publication of Marvin Harris's The Rise of Ethnological Theory that a lot of anthropologists, in addition to me, became more aware of that. It's not that they were ignorant of it, I suppose, as much as they didn't emphasize it or make it an important part of how they viewed the history of anthropology. I would like to give one note that I didn't before, and that is that this course today is extremely current. In other words, this kind of course would be offered in many different departments in many different universities throughout the country. And it's considered an essential segment of learning that undergraduates and graduate students should have if they call themselves anthropology majors. But I would like to credit one of my former professors who was given a grant by the National Endowment for the Humanities, who created a version of this course way back in the 60s, early 60s, when I was a graduate student. So the first time I was exposed to a lot of these ideas and notions in a historical, chronological fashion came from him. And again, I mentioned him last time, but I'll repeat it again because he's one of my intellectual ancestors, or my anthropological ancestors, and an important one. And his name was Joseph Casagrande, Italian, not Hispanic, of Italian descent, I should say. So anyway, that's the first point that we covered. Then secondly, I went through a brief overview of my own work, and to show you the shift that has occurred in the 30-plus years I've been here at the University of Houston. I went from being an economic anthropologist to being what we call today a medical anthropologist. And I emphasize again that economic anthropology and medical anthropology weren't necessarily subfields of cultural anthropology or biological anthropology or any other kind of anthropology when I was in graduate school. These were both subfields that were created since I have come to the University of Houston those many years ago. So that was that. And I talked about the plantation studies I had done, and now I do work with people who are HIV. One of the things I didn't mention is that if you'll notice on the syllabus, when it shows my name and then gives all the spaghetti afterwards, the initials, it's PhD, which of course is not uncommon at a university, but it also says LMSW ACP, and what that refers to is that I'm also a licensed master of social work, advanced clinical practitioner. And that's not patting myself on the back. What that should tell you, though, is that I have done work and do work all the time in psychological anthropology, and I am also a therapist in my other life and work with people primarily who are HIV positive. Previously, it was working with people who were terminally ill. Currently, it's working with people who are trying to maintain some quality of life and how they can open themselves back up to living once they had thought they had been in a more or less terminal situation. So that's just more about me that you know now in terms of the kind of work that I do. And it also should serve as a role model for you that you can bring these two fields together and create a career for yourselves. In other words, I can see that I can teach in a university now, or I could very easily switch to a non-university setting and have a very satisfactory career working with individuals. And then we went to some of the additional course themes, and I talked about the breadth of anthropology as a discipline, and in that segment I talked about the different work that people in our department do. And if the camera could turn on the written page here and show you, I have written down holism. And that's essentially the concept in anthropology that refers to, meaning that if we look at the individual characteristics of each anthropologist, including myself, or any anthropologist anywhere, it would seem as if their work is unique, somehow not connected with, somehow apart from all of those other anthropologists. And the reason for doing that was to show you that, yes, while their work is specific, while their work is unique to them, that it all does contribute to that larger field of anthropology. And that characteristics is called holistic in the sense that it integrates information not only from cultural anthropology or ethnology, which, by the way, comprises the largest number of anthropologists. There are more ethnologists and cultural anthropologists in that sense than any other group. But that doesn't make them more important just because there are more of them. It just means more students choose that as a specialization and go on with that. But integrating the work not only of ethnology then, or cultural anthropology, but also archaeology is very important, as you all know, linguistic anthropology and biological anthropology. I'm not saying that one of these subdisciplines is more important than the other. What I'm saying, and the emphasis of those remarks, what you come away with is this notion that all of these various subfields and the kinds of work that these individual anthropologists do contributes to the larger field, this holistic enterprise that we call anthropology. Okay, and so that was another course theme that I mentioned to you. There was another one that there has been a shift always, seemingly, between natural science and humanism. And we talked about that to somewhat. And it's always interesting to me, again, because as I think I indicated in my biography, I can't cross my arms. In my biography, I mentioned that I had been a philosophy major as an undergraduate. And that's when I first heard about and got these notions of humanistic and science or empiricism or materialism, whatever you want to call it. And that there was this seeming antagonism between them. But I don't really see it as an antagonism. I almost just see it as something like a Marxist notion of a dialectic, in the sense that while there's this antagonism, they always seem to play off of each other. They always seem to shift. I mean, there's that basis for going from one extreme to the other. And each subsequent period or chapter in the history of anthropology appears to go towards one side or the other. And it's just interesting. And another generalization I could make about that I didn't remember to include last time, and I became aware of it more. I mean, there are exceptions to this, right? Any generalization you make, there are always exceptions, so don't try to catch me. But one of the generalizations I think that one can make is that when there are conservative political times, there tends to be the emergence of theories that are more inclined towards the biological, natural science, or materialist kinds of notions. And when you come into a period of liberal political philosophy, then the segments of the discipline that seem to emerge as dominant appear to be more towards the humanistic side of the continuum, or end of the continuum. Now, obviously, there are important exceptions to that. For example, postmodernism, I think, is an important field, subfield of anthropology or anthropological theory, variation, however you want to phrase it. That's important now, and I certainly am aware that this is a conservative political time. But I would never have imagined, postmodernism doesn't surprise me, doesn't jolt me, doesn't jar me, doesn't cause me to lose sleep at night. But in the 1980s, when Reagan came into power, and sociobiology and psychobiology and the psychology discipline became an important subfield and theoretical approach in anthropology, I was jolted. And a lot of anthropologists were jarred even further than I. And there was an anthropologist in our department who no longer is with us, not because the idea or what she said was so unacceptable, but because she said that those books should be burned, which I thought was a novel idea, especially for an academic to make. But it was just so revolutionary and so different to what anthropologists of that time frame, meaning anybody who was educated before the early 80s, before Reagan, would ever have thought that anthropologists would talk about. You know, today that field is known as evolutionary biology in psychology. So if you're a psychology major, and I know some of you are, and also in the home audience, this is that field today. It's called evolutionary biology. And it's an important direction in anthropological theory as well. as Rondelet tells us in his book, Science, Reason, and Anthropology, which is a book that's published in 1997, which no one is required to read, whether they are in the, the TV studio or in the home audience. So don't worry. I'm not adding another book for you, but merely giving you another resource should you want it. And then another one is this, as I say, this shift. That it's kind of the same point, but made in different adjectives. And that is the shift between materialism and humanism. And a lot of that is based in the history, again, of Western civilization, this antagonism, this constant one playing off the other, one shaping the other, I think also as well. And if one thinks this is only true of the social sciences, we're wrong. It's also equally true of the natural sciences. I know physics especially, which is certainly a field in the natural sciences that is given great respect, if one can measure respect by the virtue of the resources that are turned over to it at any university setting. I mean, I don't know any other building on campus, for example, that's given to one professor. And I'm talking about the building that's given over to Paul Chu, an eminent physicist on this campus. But even in that field, and even in his work, and even in other physicists' work, if you'll look at the books that come out of physics many times, they also debate the same issues that the social scientists debate. The kind of controversies that we talk about in this class, the kind of shift that occurs between humanism and materialism, occurs in the natural sciences too. They also have that dual aspects to their historical framing of issues in their own disciplines. Currently there's a great deal of interest, for example, in cultural relativism. Now, it might be called something different in physics, but I can read between the lines. I know which idea they're talking about. I can identify cultural relativism there as much as I can identify it, for example, in early writings before the 19th century. Even if we go back before Socrates, there are ideas that are stated in the literature from Greeks that really do talk about cultural variation. Notice I said cultural variation. And those have been ideas that have been around for a long, long time. And they contribute to this notion or discussions, as I mentioned last time, of what we call sometimes human nature. Because human nature is, I think, the popular culture's way of talking about anthropological things. And your fathers and grandfathers and mothers and grandmothers may not know what anthropology is, but they'll have some ideas about human nature. And then finally, and importantly, I think, I said there is an assumption among all anthropologists of whatever generation that there is somehow always this interconnection, some degree of integration between culture, technology, and environment. Now, granted, postmodernists, for example, or more humanist scholars of today might not emphasize that, but it still becomes a focus against which they react. So then it remains a part even of their agenda. And I would also remind you that the greater number of anthropologists, when we look at the larger field, are still, or continue to be, materialists. So I would say that materialists are still the dominant mode of expression in terms of theoretical approaches and orientations in anthropology. But the work of post-structuralists and postmodernists represents, if you will, an important digression, an important, digression is the wrong word because it makes it sound unimportant. It's an important alternative or option that students can take or approach. This is the same way that in the latter part of the 19th century, while social Darwinism was important, at the same time that social Darwinism became a common topic, Socialism also was a common topic, but it's never recaptured when we talk about the latter part of the 19th century or Victorian era. And I live in an area that's part of the Victorian era, the Heights. When you look at Victorian houses, etc., that, and I like being there because it reminds me I'm in a previous life, and I can fantasize about that a little bit. But socialism had an advent and importance at the same time as social Darwinism. And socialism was very important in the sense that you can see all kinds of responses to it in your life today. And one of them is that the public universities. Public universities exist today because somebody way back in the early part of the 19th century or parts of the 19th century knew that it was important when you have industrialization, which of course was beginning in the 19th century, that you have a skilled, trained workforce. Where better to get that than to send all these people who lived in rural locations to some kind of trade school or some kind of public university where they could receive more education and more training. So this tradition that we have in the Western world of public universities versus those private enclaves of elitists called Rice University and other esteemed institutions that we have not only locally but throughout the country, they have a different history. But our history is part of that larger one that industrial barons, if you will, or people who were involved in creating fortunes and industrial opportunities in the past century, especially increasing in intensity towards the latter half of the century, they realized the importance of public education and giving students or citizens the opportunity to become more thoroughly trained. Because, what was life like? When I talk to my mother again, she's an important reference point for me, because she was so different than I was, and different than you are. I feel I can communicate with students of whatever age. My mother could not have. She did not communicate with people younger than her, including her son. And this is not some kind of deep-seated resentment I have. I actually loved her very much. It does, however, to do with the fact that her worldview was very different. For us, if this lecture, especially here in the TV studio, were to start 5 minutes late, it would cause a lot of problems. But back in my mother's youth, when she was some of your ages, she would have thought in terms of seasons. This is the planting season. We need to be home and doing whatever we need to be doing. Or this is the harvest season, so the women folk need to be gathering together and making these large dinners. And I remember going to those dinners as a small child, and they would make the dinner for all the people who were doing the harvesting. You didn't just harvest your own farm production, right, or byproducts. You would also do it as a group in your area, and it was good neighbors and relatives that got together and did these things jointly and did these things together. And then there was the winter, which was kind of the fallow period, in which there really wasn't much to do. It was kind of like this notion that we have that school teachers teach from September or June. I guess here they teach from August until May or June, and then they have that rest of the year off. Well, farmers at that time thought, and still think, that this is not the time to be doing that much work. It was less intensive. It was kind of, it was a fallow period for the earth. It was kind of a slowed activity on the part of the farmers. So she thought in terms of seasons, and that's a very different thing, and that's what had to be changed, because then they were recruiting people to come into the cities, to come into urban areas where factories were located at that time, usually in the inner city, what we today call the inner city. That's why there's a loop, and the loop turns out to be important as a dividing line or a separation, because it was in the inner city that you had not only the political institutions, the economic and commercial life of the city, but also factories. There was a section of the city that was turned over to factories, and you just couldn't, rely as much on farmers or rural folks to come in and know exactly or immediately how to behave. I mean, it was, part of that public education, part of the introduction of university life to the larger citizenry in the Western world had to do with letting them know that they had to be to work at 8 o'clock in the morning. It wasn't about planting, growing, harvesting, and fallow. It was about every day, 8 to 5. They even went, as most of you have heard, I'm sure at one time or another, into a period in which they were recruiting women and children and working them 18, 20 hours a day. And those sweatshops, as they were called, the legislation then occurred to take them away, except that obviously, apparently, they still occur in the garment industry among folks who are migrants to this country. I know that as fact, not just from television, because having kept in contact with Ecuadorians that I know, some of them have migrated to this country in New York, for example, which is a very prominent target for migration. They come to the city, they can't speak any other language other than Spanish, so they become, if you will, controlled by the other folks who speak Spanish, and then have them under control in that sweatshop, that garment industry location, and it's almost slavery, if it's not slavery. In some ways, I think it's slavery, because they work very long hours for very low pay, and they can't complain to anyone, because they're not here legally. So it's that bind. They come here for greater opportunity, the American dream, if you will. They get here, and they find that their situation is actually much worse off than that which they left, because of that linguistic and limitation that they have, and also the identification of the kind of migrant status they have, being an illegal person in terms of their visa or whatever, documentation. Undocumented workers, we call them sometimes here in Texas, but Texas seems to be more open to undocumented workers, etc. And it's not, the garment industry isn't as important an industry here. But again, that's just to show you this difference between my mother's era and this era. Yeah, you have a question? Why don't you hit your microphone? Oh, it didn't work? Okay, maybe it works in terms of the TV. I mean, we can all hear you, right? So I can ask, is it working for the home audience? Okay, and hold it as you speak. Okay, thank you. Hold it and now speak. Ask your question or your comment.
In regard to these great numbers of illegal aliens who come in and are working in the sweatshops because of their inability to assimilate with the greater culture, are there not enough volunteers? Are there not enough social organizations that desire to help these people? Primarily a social organization I'm thinking of would be a church.
Yes, if these people felt free to do that, to make their identity and their presence known. But often, that's what I'm saying, it's kind of an enslavement, in quotes, because they don't feel free to go to the churches. They don't know they can go to the churches. And they would have to go to a church, if they did know that someone spoke Spanish. And now, granted, in a city like New York, there might actually be that kind of option. But I don't think. But you have to be aware of that option, and the church in turn would have to be aware of their presence, and oftentimes that just doesn't occur. They don't know about it. It remains for a news reporter of one identity or another to somehow expose these sweatshops in current days. But in the latter part of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century, these sweatshops were known about, but they weren't necessarily despised. And they didn't necessarily just recruit people from other countries. They recruited your cousins, your mothers, your children, etc., that were in your families and that they knew, or that you would know. And So part of this thing, or the rise of socialist influences in the Western world, had to do with kind of an enlightenment, not in the sense of the century of enlightenment, but just a greater awareness that an educated workforce is not only a happy workforce, but it's also a workforce that's more compliant with the kinds of needs that are necessary to be complied with for an industrial setting. And that sometimes means you don't overwork them. So then there were a lot of laws introduced at this time that limited how much a child could work, how much anyone could work, and this notion of an 8-hour workday became important. But you know, farm folks, like my relatives, didn't know that. They didn't think in terms of an 8-hour workday, and they thought it was frivolous. And I know my own relatives, coffee breaks twice a day, and you have lunch too. Of course, they didn't. They weren't part of this life that most of us are aware of and have come into. The same way that now we could talk about a whole different chapter. And again, what I'm trying to give you here as a background is to let you realize that very common facts like what I'm talking about, historically speaking, have to do with different chapters in anthropological theory, have to do with different chapters in the academic history of the Western world, both in Europe, on the continent, in England, and in the United States. To some extent, there are some parallels in other parts of the world and the development of higher education in terms of the institutional presentations, etc. But each country has kind of individual variations, and they're not always what we think they are. And it doesn't mean they're lesser. It means they're different. And they're byproducts of different historical traditions. But we share a much closer heritage with Western Europe especially, and England, and Canada, etc., so that there's a greater commonality as well. So that was a point just to illustrate that at the same time that social Darwinism in the latter part of the 19th century was such a common way of expressing things, that socialism developed at the same time. Social Darwinism is something that we associate, or I associate, with the rise of capitalism and capitalist values and the capitalist ways of viewing things. Socialism I don't associate with that. But it's interesting to note that they actually developed at a parallel time, and somehow history forgets that. Popular history forgets that. And we think of the Victorian era as being an era of capitalist domination in terms of mode of thought and expression. But regardless, public education is an important byproduct, I think, of another strain or intellectual tradition that came or reemerged in the latter part of the 19th century that we call socialism. And anyway, now that I've kind of given you that, and you have this concept of holism, which is kind of that anthropology as a discipline kind of owes its integration, its ability to integrate various and seemingly very disparate particles of knowledge, if you will, or fields of, or subfields, I guess I should say, of anthropological knowledge, is able to bring them together under the same rubric that we call anthropology. One of the problems today within this discipline of anthropology, and it's, I think, a problem that's repeated in many of the social sciences, is that it's like almost as if there's a centrifugal force now. Is it centrifugal or centripetal? Anyway, you know, it's like everything's going so fast that there's a kind of a tendency or a proclivity to separate. You know, some departments want, archaeologists say, well, I don't have that much to say to ethnologists. Ethnologists say, oh, I don't have anything to say to a linguist, or somebody who's studying hair strands among Fiji Islanders and only wants to talk about the biological characteristics of those people. Or linguistic analysis sometimes gets so exotic and rare that I have nothing to say to them, and in return they have nothing to say to me. I say to you, in response to that the richness of anthropology is owed primarily to the fact that all of these people contribute to this field that we call anthropology. In that sense, I suppose I could be described as conservative in my approach. I say, this is the more correct approach, but that doesn't mean you have to think of it that way. In other words, the argument is there some kind of integration that should occur among these subfields that focus on human behavior and the study of human behavior, or should anthropology more appropriately be about making more, quote, natural alliances? For example, some ethnologists feel much more comfortable with the subfield of literary criticism in English and other language departments, for example, because they see that it becomes there are a system of ways of looking at things that these ethnologists, these postmodernists, are attracted to, and it speaks to them, it informs them, it makes them more aware of what they think it should be about. The same way that biological anthropologists oftentimes find themselves being hired in schools of public health. And public health becomes a very dominant kind of institutional arrangement in our society and culture that attracts biological anthropologists. And there they find all kinds of people who haven't had anthropology, but they seem to be able to talk to one another. Look down and see all my students here behind the posts, etc. I can't imagine why you would choose those seats, but that's neither here nor there. I guess there's a monitor you can see, isn't there? So that the biological anthropologist in that public health setting feels suddenly that they have people they can talk to more readily about the uniqueness of their research. The research somehow becomes now less unique and exotic and becomes more mundane and common because everybody seems to know something about it. And in terms of linguistics, I suppose if there are linguists outside of anthropology, there are linguists who are in language departments again, and sometimes they have a kind of a natural inclination or a feeling of being more a part of that. So, but I still say the richness of anthropology comes from these seemingly disparate ways of being an anthropologist, and to be able to bring that together and to integrate it, and in that context we call that, very importantly, that anthropology is holistic in its approach to its studies, and that's what that refers to. So all of those works that I talked about last time are important in that sense, in the sense that the work that Dr. Widmer does really relates and contributes to the study of human behavior and this notion of the concept of culture. Humans as tool makers. You can't study lithic industries without, little stone pieces, without realizing that the larger topic, the larger background is that it's humans who make tools, and it's only, as far as we know, primates who have this ability, since in the recent decades we've discovered that chimpanzees and other primates have at least a prototypical way of making tools. Chimpanzees stick sticks into termite-laden branches, pull them out, and are able to eat them. But that's a tool. If you remember the Space 2000, is that what it's called? The movie Stanley Kubrick's, one of his earlier splashes. I think more of a splash than Eyes Wide Shut. One of the important parts of that was at the beginning of the film. If any of you remember seeing that film, it shows these what actually I think they were supposed to be Australopithecines. Playing around and having this one Australopithecine has this bone of a cadaver or an animal they've killed, or it could even be one of their own or similar creature that they've murdered. We would call it murder. They probably, I don't know if they had that kind of concept. I have no idea. But anyway, he hits it and then it goes into the air, and then in that metaphorical sense that only literary presentations can give us, or more artistic presentations, it becomes a spaceship, and the idea there is they are all tools. So even though the tool of this Australopithecine, very primate-looking creature, hairy, etc., kind of humped over, that's what you got to do if you're going to make something look like a primate. Yeah. I don't know that all monkeys at the zoo or whatever look like that, but that's at least Hollywood's version. But anyway, it worked. The metaphor was there. And it informed us, importantly, I think, about the importance of tools. And so when we look at something like Dr. Widmer's work that seems so unrelated to my own, well, there's the connection. That's the holistic part of it. And I could go through that, and I don't want to do that because that would just repeat some of the major points I made last time about their work. But holism is the important thing for you to be getting out of this, and to look in your texts to get, and to see that there are connecting, overarching not only questions that are posed by anthropologists about, what's universal about human behavior and what makes them different. How do we account for human variation, not only biologically but culturally? That comes very importantly from this underlying emphasis that anthropology, generation after generation from the 19th century, has given us, which we call holism, or holistic aspects of theoretical development. Any questions? Everybody's okay? Everybody understands everything I said? No questions, right? Okay, well, good. Just interruption, just for a moment. He's not here. I don't know why, because he had told me he would be here today, but there is a graduate student in our department, Jose Martinez, who wants to do a study of not only this class, but also the home viewers, the distance education students, to do a study of the kind of interaction that occurs between the instructor and the student. And so even though there are these TV lights here and the monitors and you have to push a microphone, which is a little artificial for all of us, I think, still we want to encourage interaction so that he will have something to study, I guess. Otherwise, it will be kind of a bleak study and he will come to me crying, and I hate to see graduate students cry. They weep, and weep. I can do nothing for them. But I'm just kidding, obviously. But he also include this, I gather, in terms of the interactions between the distance education students, wherever you are. And that would have to do with, again, the encouragement that we give you in the syllabus to get on to do it by email or to do it with the website or however you do those things that I still don't understand that well, being born in 1938. And, I'm of that generation Margaret Mead talked about as being bereft. We were neither a part of the earlier pre-war general folks who were more like my mother, farm-oriented, etc. But we also weren't part of the post-war generations that gave rise to the baby boomers, etc., that became more technologically literate, and those things don't upset you as much. In my generation, there's still people who, including myself, who have no idea why a computer works the way it does. I know how to use a computer. I know how to work with a computer, but I don't understand a computer. I don't have an I-thou relationship with my computer. That's supposed to be a deficiency on my part. I don't accept it, of course, as a deficiency. All right, now what I want to turn to and briefly give... Oh, yes, you have a question. Good.
In reply to your request for questions and perhaps why there aren't any questions, because of our technology, we have you on Channel 8 Wednesday and Friday mornings from 3:20 a.m. to 5. We can record it if we'd like, or sit and watch it then, and hear everything you've said and record it in any way we want. And if we've missed anything, we can pick it up.
Unless there's something immediate. To ask questions, and I'm not encouraging you to ask questions simply for something you don't, to clear up a point. It's also if you have points to make, or if you have something you want to engage all of us in a greater discussion about. I like to encourage that in all classes. It's not, I don't want you to see this as some kind of, what's the word, hegemony, where I'm at the top and you're at the bottom, and I know everything and you know nothing. That's not what a classroom experience should be about, in my mind. It should be more about a didactic, interactive kind of thing where students sometimes have viewpoints that are as important in giving material as mine. Yeah.
I wanted to refer about one thing that you said about the shift, that where the two, the kind of discourse in anthropological work comes, or it can be situated in any kind of realm of natural science, from natural sciences to humanistic point of view. Now, what I would like to say is that how can we, for example, say that postmodern discourse would be a humanistic discourse when all the epistemological structure or the way everything relates to each one in a study, it is, I would say, built up with different postulates and different axioms. So I would say, could we be more specific, for example, when we mean what is human, what do we mean with humanism, or what do we mean with natural sciences?
Yes, we could. And, there is no one postmodernism either. Postmodernism is made up of many theories, many viewpoints, etc. And I think its demarcation, its line of identification seems to be that it's anti-science. It denies positivism, which is something I wanted to get to today. It denies this notion that there's a real world out there that can be studied and measured, and love and hate and fear and what some of the other emotions can be looked at. And scientists say this. I want you to think that. And the postmodernists, if they're united on a point, it would be that just isn't possible. That science is not appropriate to the study of humans and human behavior. That humans are about variation in individuals. And what science does is categorize people. What science does is make them amenable to, we all say we don't want to be numbers, we don't want to be categories. We want to be seen as the individuals that we are, and postmodern agrees with them at a theoretical level. That is the point, I would say, that is of commonality for postmodernists. Beyond that, they have many different concepts, contributions, ways of looking at things, etc. Science, in that same context, then becomes a matter, when it looks at human beings, it becomes a matter of seemingly stripping away your individuality. And in the Western world, that's very important. That's almost sinful to think of that. I'm not a number. You'll say when you're at the line at the bursar's office. Well, in the bursar's eyes, you are a number, whatever your Social Security number is. It's more important to them than your name. Your name means nothing to them. Or when you call on the phone about a balance on your credit card, they want to know your ID number. Etc. And that's what science is about, because there you're talking about statistics, the management of numbers as they apply to human populations, and that's what those companies employ a lot. And it's very similar to the same kind of manipulation of numerical kinds of data that you get in physics, or you get in mathematics, or you get in chemistry, etc., as a natural science. So that's the aspects of natural science I'm talking about. That isn't a good definition of natural science, but it certainly tells you where these two viewpoints stand with respect to one another. If we take it back in history, the same debate is occurring. It's going on. A lot of the way that anthropologists see themselves as responding, if we were to go back to the 19th century, back to 1859, and I'm writing those in big numbers, is in terms of that publication of Darwin's Origin of the Species. It was to get us out from under the if you will, the domination of the church and theology, and the seeming paralysis of open knowledge and empirical examination and just looking what's around us and talking about it, because we were supposedly under the theological viewpoint, which I don't know if I'd call it humanistic, but it certainly wasn't scientific, was to tell us that everybody was divinely created by a God, and that the universe itself was dominated by a deity, and that deity has a continued interest in the running of this universe. This is a Western thing, right? And that the deity is somehow removed from us, but yet connected with us. And so what theology and monasteries and other folks of that profession and specialization told us is how we were supposed to view things. Monarchies, our political elites, were divinely appointed. The royal families were identified by God. God made them the king of England and the king of whomever they became the king of. That was a whole different worldview. It's those worldviews that anthropologists are interested in when we try to recapture the history of thought in the Western world. How did people think about things at that time? How did they make sense out of the world around them? And if you get before the 18th century, certainly, you're more into a period of time in which theology reigned supreme. And there were no options in that period of Western history. And so that's the way they viewed the world. So then you come into the Enlightenment, in which you have John Locke and other folks talking about human beings. And he talks about a tabula rasa. I'll get to use all this technology here. I think it's R-A-S-A, isn't it? Because it's not Spanish, it's Latin. An empty cabinet is what that meant, and that was a notion that anthropologists really seized upon in the 40s, but we're talking now about this, which would be the Enlightenment or the 18th century. That people were like empty cabinets that had to be filled, or parchment, pieces of parchment, a paper that's blank, that has to be written on, and that which gets written is your life's experiences, and that's what determines whom you become. And that's what that was heretical to the church's position. The church thought, you can only learn about humans by divine inspiration, and God tells us what people are like. So you look to the scriptures to tell us how you're supposed to behave and what humans are supposed to do and the kinds of creatures that they are, and they are created by God. Natural scientists coming in the 19th and then more importantly in the latter part of the 19th century tell us that we are animals, not divine creatures of God. And at that time there was an antagonism that's very important in the history of anthropology, which I don't think is necessarily there today, except maybe among Southern Baptists. And if you happen to be Southern Baptists, I'm not berating you, I'm just saying that we have a difference of opinion. But other churches, other theological positions currently they're not opposed to Darwinian notions and Darwinistic, even the Catholic Church. And I say even the Catholic Church because we tend to identify them with more conservative kinds of causes, has long before many of the Protestant churches come to an accommodation with Darwinian thought and have incorporated it into their own teachings. And there are many Catholic anthropologists that are important in Catholic thinking and Catholic history that use Darwin and Darwinian ideas. I don't know if I answered your question or not, but we certainly went off with it. Okay. Today, science is very different than what it was in the 40s, is very different than what it was in the 19th century, and is very different than what it was back at this time of the Enlightenment, or one of the earlier time when the Scottish philosophers were making all these kinds of heretical statements, at least with respect to the dominant church's position or the theological orientation. So anyway, you have this tabula rasa, which is an empty slate, and that's the way these humans were viewed. And so it was left to your life's experiences, what happened to you that made you the creature that you were. And this was an Enlightenment or 18th century notion, predominantly, not only discussed, but predominantly made popular or famous by this intellectual heir that we have called, named John Locke. One of the things I want to give you right now is kind of an overview of where we're going, and then what time we have left, we'll talk about the 19th century anthropology. But before that, remember I told you that we were going to focus in this class on 3 different segments of anthropological thought and theory, meaning that that's where I'm going to spend most of my time discussing and lecturing on. And the first one we call the Classical Evolutionists. And by this, I'm talking about cultural evolutionists now. And we'll get into this in greater detail in a few days. if I've spelled that. That's Evolutionist. It doesn't look quite like that. Maybe I should write it over. Okay, there we go. It's now spelled correctly. And that I would associate with a period in our own history called Capitalism Triumphant. And these labels come to us from an anthropologist by the name of Eric Wolf, W-O-L-F. And Eric Wolf in 1969 wrote an article called American Anthropology and American Anthropologists. And he kind of provided me with the framework that I use now or currently in terms of dividing us up our own history into various chapters or segments. And, you know, we can, to the extent that we can agree with him, we agree with him in terms of these historical periods, and to the extent, but that doesn't mean that we're all bound by it or what have you. So the first one is called Capitalism Triumphant, and it's associated with these classical evolutionists. This is the time of social Darwinism. This is the Victorian era. This is when slavery was becoming widespread throughout the world. This is when industrialization was becoming a mode of technology that was spreading throughout the world. And all these things have to be associated with one another. Laissez-faire as a concept was being developed and by economic thinkers and spreading to other parts of the world. And all these things were occurring simultaneously. And those are some of the major points that I would associate with Capitalism Triumphant, or the Victorian era, what do you want to call it. He called it Capitalism Triumphant. The second period, which becomes the period in our history that's more often or most often the definitive chapter, if you will, in our history that's associated with American anthropology. There was this same chapter doesn't occur in the same way in British anthropology even. They never got wedded to this notion of cultural relativism that we like so much in our own version or vision of what anthropology is and can become. Cultural variation was the hallmark of this time, and really it can be associated with Franklin Delano Roosevelt and the New Deal. And I know most of you have no idea what I'm talking about. At least you know Roosevelt was president and not the earlier one, Theodore. But anyway, he called, Wolf labeled this time in our history as the intermittent liberal reform. This is important, and I will make a couple of comments that I think will show you the depth of its influence even to the present day. He called it intermittent liberal reform, but social science is predominantly liberal in its viewpoint. When you read social science ideas, when you think about things in a socially scientific way, when you, for example, take seriously and look at this important concept of cultural relativism, it's a liberal notion. It's not a conservative notion. It's interesting that in modern times, when universities and other institutions are interested in looking at the pluralistic nature of our society, they don't call it cultural relativism. They don't call it what anthropologists might have called it, which is cultural integration. They talk about ethnic diversity or cultural diversity. I don't know what that leads, but I know that, or what that leads to, but I know that eventually it's going to become a set of notions that's more comfortably placed in a conservative political context, because that's the era in which those notions came about. Because we are in a conservative. But any anthropologist, I hit the microphone. Any anthropologist of my generation or earlier is liberal. We were trained in a liberal discipline. We were trained with liberal notions, and liberalism was not a sin. At that time, it was considered, the salvation, because after all, our country had gone through a depression. Roosevelt came into power, and all those public works projects that he brought us into made people employable and employed, more importantly, the latter. And people were importantly and strongly liberal. And it's only and since that time in our era of Reagan, when he was president, to the present time, that liberalism seems to have become somehow sinful. So anthropologists, I think, sometimes kind of don't want you to know that they have those liberal ideas lurking in their academic and intellectual background. But anyway, that's that second chapter. And then the third one, you got okay.
Yeah, I was just wondering if you could clarify a little bit what you mean by liberal when you use it in reference to anthropology.
Cultural relativism, really. Primarily this notion that it's a kind of a moral relativistic approach. It's a notion that everybody's equally good. There is no one superior way of thinking about things. There's no one right way of solving a particular problem. If we look at the inventory of human culture out there, if we look at the different ways of being human, the different ways of experiencing being a human, they're all equally good. That's what the people in the earlier times said. And that's the folks who created this notion of cultural relativism, which is an important demarcation or a line in the sand, if you will, for anthropological thought, and also identification of the field by others. If I go into the psychology department today, even though cultural relativism was a notion that was developed most thoroughly in the 30s and 40s, they would say, oh yes, the discipline that's concerned with cultural relativism. Because it became what most scholars now identify or associate this discipline with, if you're a cultural anthropologist. And then by indirectly, then that extends to other subfields of anthropology as well. There's linguistic relativism. There's, I assume, when you're talking about biological variation, you're not talking about which biology or set of genes is more superior than another. Biologists would tell you there is no superior set of genes. There is no perfect or superhuman. There's no Aryan race in that context. There is, genes are either superior or less superior in terms of the environment in which they find themselves and in the ability that it affords that individual or group to be able to adapt to that environment. That's what they define. So all of those notions somehow, to me, have continuity to them. And they go from the biology to the linguistic to the archaeology to the cultural or ethnological.
Okay, and so did you also say that we're moving towards more of a conservative frame of thought?
Not moving. We've been there for a while. We've been there for a while. Well, sociobiology is the most striking example of it. There's almost been a counter response in terms of postmodernism, for example, that science doesn't work, that we can't talk about that as applicable to the study of human behavior. What other things can I talk about as being a conservative bent? But it changes from generation to generation. That's the thing. It's just like, Catholics used to tell us that Roman Catholicism was continuous and never changed. But yet, in my travels, I've discovered that being Roman Catholic in Latin America is very different than being Roman Catholic in Anglo-America. All right, I'm not talking about the United States. I'm talking about Latin America versus Anglo-America. And I assume in other parts of the world as well, that if you were Roman Catholic in Thailand, it would be a very different experience of being Roman Catholic. So the same thing, when you're talking about liberal or conservative, it means different things. It means different things in different generations and in different areas. So it's never that uniform. Yeah. Okay. And then the third period that Wolff talks about, I think, was a misnomer, although it works to a certain extent. He called it the military-industrial complex after Eisenhower's comments or identification in the 50s of the military-industrial complex when he was warning us of its threat and its imminence and predominance and how it was going to In other words, multinational corporations were the enemy, and we had to be very careful and come up with some ways of monitoring their behavior. Not totally incorrect, I might add, but not necessarily accurate either. And that I associate then with the rise of materialist notions, again, which I would cite as being in the work of Julian Stewart, Marvin Harris, and people who were trained or students or colleagues of those anthropologists. And that brings us through, up into the present day. It's not that people stop thinking with Julian Stewart, it's that those people who are materialists today, their ideas are primarily influenced by his work, and they represent deviations or developments of that work and of those notions. But he was primarily, again, concerned with those basic questions that I talked about the last time, and that is, what's universal about human behavior, and how do you account for cultural variation? And if I were to summarize his work, and he's an important anthropologist, it would be, how do you account for variation? He accounted for it in that generalization I talked to you about last time, in terms of the technology, the environment, and the, I believe it was culture, and that interaction or association among those factors. Okay. One of the things I think that we want to do is look at this whole notion of what's occurred really since the 50s and the 60s in terms of this military-industrial complex. I see it less importantly where he did, and I see it more importantly as what we've moved into is a whole new chapter of history, a whole new way of looking at things, and that comes about from the very technology that makes this class available, but primarily computers and the computerization of our culture and our society. That's where it goes to. That's where the technological basis of what happens now. And this gives us this ability, for example, in the Republican side, in the conservative side, of again promoting the notion of the individual. And this is what got Newt Gingrich in trouble in terms of ideas. I mean, the press doesn't talk about that. But what he was teaching in his class were the ideas that were expressed in Alvin Toffler's The Third Wave, which was a book that I think that was published in the 70s. And its notion was that with each wave of technological development, there have been worldwide shifts, if you will, in terms of worldviews. And the first one, of course, we had hunters and gatherers. I mean, this is very anthropological, and that's why he's thought of as an anthropologist. Although, as far as I know, he's just a good writer and talks about and writes about anthropological things. But most anthropologists, unfortunately, aren't as skilled communicators in that way. So anyway, he talks about the first revolution, which was hunting and gathering. Then, of course, that's not a revolution. That's just the way we were and when we emerged. More than 10,000 years ago. It'll be 75,000 years ago, we'll say. And, of course, biological anthropologists are constantly moving that back, so we have to be careful. But when Cro-Magnon or Homo sapiens sapiens first emerged, we were mostly hunters and gatherers. We were only hunters and gatherers, etc. But somewhere about 10,000 years ago, or even longer, in terms of the precedents, or precedents, the first cities started emerging, first divisions of labors, first specialists started occurring, first centers of domestication and agricultural development started appearing, and that was the second wave. And the third wave was this industrialization, as I say, began to occur in a meaningful and an important way, in a widespread way, in the latter part of the 19th century. Well, since then, though, I don't think we're just, I don't see computers and the electronicization of our society as being just kind of a further extension of the industrialization of this society. I see it as a separate chapter now. We're moving into a whole new period that's going to give your generation and your children's generations, more importantly, a whole new way of thinking about themselves, a whole new way, a whole new language. I mean, already in our language, we talk about being hardwired. This is the hardwired part of our body, and then there's software part of our body. Well, those concepts would mean nothing to my grandmother. Nothing. She died in 1949. Most of the things that you talk about every day my grandmother would have to say, "What's that?" You know, that's what we lose when we look back. We don't realize how different worldviews were that recently. That said, be 1950 more or less. That's about 50 years ago. You know, but people saw things entirely differently. Okay. So that's primarily what I would be thinking of. And why do I say that fits into a conservative philosophy? Why does that seemingly promote Republicans' agendas? Well, I think it fits in because it re-emphasizes the individual, it de-emphasizes the central city or the inner city, and it allows suburbs to become the centers of cultural development, if you will, or your neighborhood. In other words, what Toffler was envisioning, I don't know if it's ever totally come to pass, but what he was envisioning was that the computer was allowing individuals to stay at home. You know, you could do work for an insurance company, for example, by being at home and having the terminal in front of you. You didn't have to go into the inner city to a large office building on the 34th floor in order to type or do the kinds of things that you might do if you work for, say, something like an insurance company. That this would allow you to stay at home. This in turn would de-emphasize this notion of sleeper communities, or whatever they call them. Is that what they call them? You know what I'm saying? People just sleep there. They don't really live there, and they go into the inner city to work. That's a kind of an older notion. You may not have heard of it as much because today people think in terms of the smaller surrounding cities now being the centers. Your church becomes more important. It's in the neighborhood. The schools that are in your neighborhood are more important in terms of where you go. You can get an education at the University of Houston. That's what distance education is all about. That's what this is about. It's saying you can take the knowledge that occurs and the individuals that occur here in the inner city at this university, and you can make it relevant in all those sites that are supposed to have thousands of students in them at Fort Bend, the West Houston Institute, the North Houston Institute, but in this case it turns out we have 50-some students, thank you, enrolled at home as a home television audience. So altogether there's about 90 students in this class. But the majority of them are not being taught or housed in those technological facilities that come from industrialization. They're being trained or taught by those kinds of facilities or facilitation that occurs as a result of the computerization of the society or the electronicization of the society. So again, local neighborhoods, local communities, local churches, local politicians suddenly take on new importance. This is the vision that Alvin Toffler had. And it seems to be a trend in Western civilization and society now. You never lose previous byproducts of these different waves of technology. As far as I know, the Roman Catholic Church is still a powerful institution. Missouri Synod, the Zen Synod of Lutherans is still an important force in this country. Southern Baptists are still important in this country, even though as institutionally they would be associated with this earlier industrial wave of technology. But at the same time, those churches are also changing and responding to the technology the same way that universities are. Universities came about in the industrial or intermittent liberal reform chapter, I would assume. But they haven't stopped changing, and they also, like all institutional arrangements, change as the technology changes and as time passes. Nothing ever remains the same, but the more things change, the more they appear to be the same. It's kind of paraphrasing a previous philosopher. Okay, we're nearing the end. Are there any questions that you have? I really didn't get that much to the 19th century. We will be continuing from here next time. I'll talk about the concepts of polygenesis and monogenesis. Those concepts are detailed in your textbook. Look in the textbooks, I should say. Look in the chapters, those sections that I've assigned to you that deal with the 19th century. And look at those ideas, because we'll be talking about them and identifying them next time. We have to wait 5 more minutes yet. Don't get up and leave. I was just notifying you that we're near the end of class. But we'll be talking about polygenesis, monogenesis. This will tell you what to look for in your textbooks as well. Social Darwinism. I would like for you to come into class, those of you who are in the class part of this, and be able to talk about and tell me what social Darwinism is. And I know that some of you have some familiarity with that concept ever before you got to this class. But certainly, if you haven't, if you somehow it was omitted from your history or your personal biography, well, then you can find it in the textbooks readily. So anyway, we'll be emphasizing talks about polygenesis and monogenesis, and they're the way I view the early part of the 19th century, and the social Darwinism we'll talk about at the latter half, and that's when we have Capitalism Triumphant. And it gets us into this time period, which we'll be talking about, where we identify this first chapter in the anthropological experience, which would be the cultural evolutionists. All right, it's time is about over, I gather. I'll briefly go over. I have kind of recapitulated many of the points I made last time and added to them. Today I have talked a lot, or added to our discussion of holism. That's an important concept. I would expect you to know what it is in certain ways, if you can't guess. And I would expect you to know that. And I talked a lot about the cultural environments, et cetera, of these various things that we've had. So